Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I am Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and this is Translation Notes, Mark 15, 16 through 20. We have a little bit of a transition passage, although it's incredibly significant. We move from Pilate handing Jesus over to the soldiers, basically taking Jesus into their hands and abusing him. And from there, in verse 21, we'll move into the crucifixion scene itself. If you haven't attended Translation Notes, and even if you have, just a reminder that in this series, we look through some of the lexical and grammatical questions that come up when translating the Greek text, in this case of Mark, into English. So we focus at the word level and then also things like inflections, parsings, clauses, participles, things, how words are used together in larger units. That's the focus of today. We focus more in Translation Notes on the Greek text and translation than we necessarily do on accordance features. If you are interested in learning more about the features of the app itself, you can go to the help menu, and there's a whole bunch of webinars here pre-recorded that you can access. We will use accordance the whole time, but this is more focused on translation itself, using accordance as a tool that helps us do that. This handout that you see on my screen is available to you in the Go to Webinar control panel. If you see the handout section, just click on that, make sure the arrow is pointed down, and you'll see a PDF. If you're here live, you'll also get this emailed to you later. And if you're not here live, if you're watching this on a recording, you can access it at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. I also put my email address here in the handout. There is a questions box that you can use to communicate with me. That's like a one-way typed chat, and I will check that throughout, and we'll invite comments at any time, and we'll read them anonymously, and questions as well are always welcome. All right, let me just respond to these individually. Thanks, glad to hear that everything is working properly. All right, let's start in on verse 16. I've got it here in the handout, as well as the notes. Most of what I'll say today is here in bullet point form. Let's open this up in accordance. I'm just going to open up a Greek text. Got it formatted how I already have it formatted. If you have taken the time to do this, under set text pane display, you can have it remember what you do in terms of size and theme and background colors and things like that. Let me know if you've got questions about that. But mine, I like to keep a slightly larger font, and I like to have the verses separate with the space in between. The downside to that is you don't see the larger context of a paragraph, but there are these paragraph markers. So I can still get a sense of what goes together. So here I can see 16 through 20, at least in the NA28, are considered to be a unit. In fact, if I open up a translation, I'll see here that this is a pretty common subdivision, pericope, if you want the technical term, titled here, Jesus is mocked. We'll come back to that in a moment, but it's verses 16 through 20. So let's begin with verse 16. Hoi de stratiotai apegagon auton eso tes aules, ha estin praetorian, kai sun kalusin halantain speran. Going left to right, we've got and or now or so. The soldiers led him, this is Jesus we're talking about, into the palace here. We'll come back to this word. That is the praetorium. And they called together the whole cohort or battalion, depending on translations. Here's how I've rendered it. So the soldiers led him into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole cohort of soldiers. Put that in brackets. It's not explicitly there, but it's implied. And I will just note that it is maybe odd to think about beginning a new section with an unspecified pronoun, but we are kind of jumping in. It's been a couple of weeks. We didn't have anything last week because of Thanksgiving, but if we read this in context, it's Jesus named even right here in verse 15. So I don't think you need to fill out that auton is Jesus here, unless you're just doing this passage all by itself, not in context. That would of course be useful to do, but I haven't done that here because this would be part of a larger translation as you work through the whole chapter. Let's start with this post-positive day, and post-positive just means that, like with the word gar, it comes second. So positive being first, post being second. So it's the second word in Greek. This is not how it is in English. This is one of many reasons why we don't want to think about translation as a decoder ring, because there just are differences in languages. If you were to go left to right or look at an interlinear, you would have so soldiers led him. And in English, of course, we put words like so or and or for or but first. They're positive, not post-positive. So we just want to put that there. Every time we have a day or chi, it's worth asking what it means. You could always, for a translational, for a provisional translation, you could just put something like but or and for day, and for chi. But if we triple click any of these words, we can see here there's actually a lot of material around this one word, and this is in BDAG. I've just triple clicked the word to see. It's used, it says, to connect one clause to another, either to express contrast or simple continuation. So that doesn't really specify. We need to look at the context to decide. And it says here, BDAG, if it's contrast, then but is the translation equivalent we would probably most likely use. And then if it's more connective, and suffices. I'm not going to belabor this point unless there's interest in it, but I will say that whole dissertations have been written on these individual particles. We see them every week, and I don't often spend a lot of time on them, but that's not because they don't deserve time. Here, I think the Net Bible, the NET New English translation, has a great note with its translation of so, and I've put that in your handout here. It's just front and center. You can also see it by clicking on the footnote. They say here, day has been translated as so to indicate that the soldier's action is in response to Pilate's condemnation of the prisoner in verse 15. So even if your initial provisional translation puts but for day just as a matter of course, this is in fact not contrasting with verse 15, it's continuing it. In other words, Pilate is already beating Jesus or having him beaten. Now he's handing him over, and it's the soldiers who take him. And so this is a continuation. So this day is not a contrastive particle here, it's continuous. And the context, I think in this case, it's not always so clear. In this case, I think it's pretty clear. So we can follow this. I think the NET note is good on this. And verse 15, by the way, I've just put my translation for that here, so you have it in the handout. We had, so Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released to them Barabbas, and after having Jesus flogged, turned him over to be crucified. So the soldiers led him into the palace, and then they're going to do their pre-crucifixion heinous acts. They're not crucifying him right away, but they're already getting close. All right, so where do they go? It says they led him, apegagan auton, so they led him into tes aules. If you triple click on this word to see it in a lexicon, you can see that there are multiple possible translations here. Courtyard may sound familiar. In fact, the last time we had that word, if I right click and search for the lexeme, it searches aule in the Greek New Testament. I'm just going to jump ahead here to Mark. The last time we had that word, it was Peter in the high priest's courtyard. So we have translated it, and I think I translated it as courtyard back then as well. So that's a possible meaning. Here, though, we've got something else, a dwelling complex of royal property, the court of a prince. BDAG locates the verse here under this definition, palace, for the translation equivalent. And if there's any uncertainty about that, Mark himself specifies with ha estin, that is, or i.e., or that is to say, or by which I mean. So he's basically defining the kind of auleis that he's talking about here. So we've got, so the soldiers led him into the courtyard. Well, no, palace, I think, following both BDAG, but also Mark, who specifies that the kind of auleis is the praetorion. Now that may not itself help us until we understand this word, but we are not talking about just a general courtyard. Mark wants to locate this as a very specific place, and by the time we've studied both of these words, we'll get a pretty clear sense of that. So here is praetorion. I think we need to understand that together with auleis to get a full understanding. Triple click this to see it in BDAG, and we've got the praetorium. In the course of history, the word also came to designate the governor's official residence, and BDAG says quite helpfully, quite specifically, this is the meaning of the word in the Gospels. Now it will note some dispute on what and where exactly we're talking about, but this, at least according to BDAG, is talking about the governor's official residence, and it's the courtyard, or I'm sorry, it's the palace here in this case. Now BDAG is not the Bible, it's interpretive, and so you may look at this differently. You may want to look at this in different lexicons. The NET note gives us here the governor's residence was the Roman governor's official residence. The one in Jerusalem may have been Herod's palace in the western part of the city, or the fortress Antonia northwest of the temple area. This, I think, would be a good word to look at further, and there are multiple ways, and I'll just kind of offer some maybe 30 seconds of suggestions for how you could do this. We won't do this now, but it does deserve further research. You could search for the word as a lexeme throughout the Bible and see where it's used, and see, for example, what else do you get in the other Gospels? Is there any more clarification about what this place is? I might also take the English word. If you can find it anywhere, you may just have to type in praetorium yourself, but I would search that in a research search, and you could find, let's just see if we can get it with that spelling. Yeah, so you'll find it throughout texts that use that translation, but you've also got more comment in your dictionaries if you do a research search. And I would also just look in your commentaries. I would open up an info pane and see, you're going to get lots of comment about not just how to translate this, but there's going to be some historical background that you may wish to delve into with this. I think the fundamental question is, I mean, there are multiple questions, but maybe the first question is, do you transliterate this or do you translate it? And different translations take different approaches, and I think they each have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage to praetorium is you're giving it the technical terminology that it seems like Mark wants to use here with the ha estin. I mean, he seems to want to define this pretty clearly with his phrase here. So the good in this translation, I think, is you're doing that. The downside is many of your readers, it may be including yourself, may not know what the praetorium is, and so you're still left with something that needs unpacking. So are you really translating it? The NET takes the translation approach, so they're not just preserving it as a technical title and bringing it over into English by way of converting the letters. They're saying this is the governor's residence. So the downside to that is if Mark wants to use this technical place name, you have not shown that in your translation, but the benefit to that is readers know what this means. So that's just something for you to think about. You'll see it's interesting to go back and look, for example, at how one of the earliest Bible translations, how the Septuagint translators dealt with the Hebrew text. They would often have similar questions do I take this name and translate it into Greek, or do I preserve the Hebrew letters and just give them Greek letters? Do I translate or transliterate? So I think that's the fundamental question here. I put some notes here. Strauss, I think, which has informed my thinking on this, he says palace courtyard, and so you could even render it that way, can refer to a courtyard surrounded by a complex of buildings or to the whole complex, the palace. Mark clarifies that is the praetorium to show he means the courtyard of Pilate's headquarters. So more research, I think, could be done there, but I think Mark is trying to locate us pretty specifically regardless. The question is just how do you bring that out in translation in a way that is accurate, faithful to Mark, and also that readers can understand. All right, last comment on this verse, and then I'll be happy to take comments or questions that you've got. So they bring him into the palace, or into the palace courtyard, that is the praetorium, the governor's residence. They called together the whole cohort of soldiers, halein tein speron. Go back to accordance and see all of the cohort. You can even see already, just in the instant details, we've got military unit as a translation equivalent. The ESV gives us battalion. BDAG gives us, in our literature, probably always cohort. And this part I've put in your handout. It notes the 10th part of a legion, thus normally 600 men, but the number varied. More research, of course, here would be beneficial, looking at a legion, and whether it's cohort or legion, you could check your commentaries, you could use that research search again if you really wanted to get deep into the structure of the battalion, the cohorts, kind of the different regiments, how they all work together. That would be a worthwhile exercise. For now, I'm just noting here what BDAG says, and I thought this was interesting in Mark Strauss's Zondervan exegetical commentary. And this is a point of interpretation. You may agree, you may disagree, you may not be sure. He says Mark is likely using the term loosely to refer to the portion of the garrison on duty at the time. I don't think Mark is wanting necessarily to give us a specific number. You might read it that way. You could say, well, if we're talking about 600 people and he's using this as a technical term and he means the whole cohort, it could mean that they called together all 600 of the cohort. I think Strauss's point is interesting. It's also possible that Mark is just using that. It's sort of like you say, you know, I was out on the roads last night and everybody was driving, or you might even say everybody and their mother was driving. And you're not lying, it was really trafficy, but of course it's not literally true that everybody was there. The idea here, whether Mark means this literally or not, and I don't know, is that it was a very large group of people. So there are lots of people here, and we can decide what we might make of that, how we might read that. Certainly for what's going to follow, which is just an utter humiliation. There are many, many people present. So I think this serves to, whether it's 600 exactly, or only half of them were on duty, or 100 were there, whatever the number is, this is a huge crowd, and many people are going to witness what's about to happen. So I think Mark, even maybe in a subtle way, is just kind of, the scene is getting maybe more significant because there are more people there. So this is the big deal. They're all gathering around. They're actually actively calling together the whole cohort of soldiers. Now, did they need that many people to follow what Pilate said to lead Jesus off to be crucified? I don't think so. I think you can do that with a smaller group. So there's already something in here that they're up to no good. And we're gonna see that. I mean, that's an understatement. We'll see that more explicitly in the verses that follow. So let's pause there. I wanted to take a little extra time for this just because we've got a couple of words, 3 words, palace, praetorium, and cohort, that I think are potentially challenging. And I also wanted to make sure we could set the stage. Let me see what comments or questions you've got. Here's someone says, for day, a slight pausal now then would be better rather than a strong contrast. But yeah, that's certainly an option. Somebody notes here, let me just see if I can gather these together. I'll just put these into the chat anonymously. Someone else says a legion also seems to vary in size, 600 to 1,000 soldiers. Thanks for that. Another comment, all cohort or all of the part of the cohort that came with Pilate to Jerusalem as the main legion was quartered in Caesarea Maritima and may not be all of a cohort would have come. Yeah, and I think, you know, it's funny, the closer I get to the Greek text of Mark, I'm more comfortable with the idea that all could not be meant literally, which, and I'm just seeing examples. I mean, I think this is a great case. And the example I gave of when you say everybody was at the grocery store because it was the day before Thanksgiving. Well, you don't mean that literally, but that doesn't compromise what you're saying. It doesn't, you know, I don't think that has to imply any particular view of scripture or anything like that. So again, that larger point that tons and tons of people there. Here's another comment more on the Praetorium. I'll put that in the chat and just read it so that you can hear it too. Somebody says Praetorium is the location of the Roman praetor, the one with military command. Current archaeology scholarship places the Praetorium adjacent and separate on the north of Herod's Pilate's palace on western wall of the old city of Jerusalem instead of the traditional fortress of Antonio. Here's a question too. These are great comments and questions. Somebody says, let me find this and put it in here. Is there any information on what part of the day this occurred? Early morning or afternoon? That is an excellent question, and it's especially relevant because we're going to get some timestamps, so to speak, in the crucifixion. And this is one of the notorious challenges, I think, of harmonizing the Gospels is how do you fit all the times together? I think regardless of your view of the Bible and of the Gospels and whatever you think theologically, I think it's pretty common belief across the board that we're describing just one in the same crucifixion, so that the times we would expect to line up. So how do we do that across the Gospels? Mark does give us a time up in verse 25. And so it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. And we'll get to delve into that more later. But I don't think we have any indication from Mark explicitly in the text of time. Anyone in the questions box, please correct me if I've missed something, but I don't think we have anything yet. So if we wanted to answer the question, what time is it right now? I mean, the answer may just be, I don't know. We don't know. Mark doesn't say. We could try to work backwards from the first definite time we have. So it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him, and we work backwards. There, we don't seem to get, I mean, we want to look for transition words here like Kai and day. We don't seem to get any like overnight indications explicitly. So at least as we read the narrative, it could read very well like what's happening here is all part of the same kind of extended time of day as the crucifixion itself. But Mark just doesn't say explicitly. I don't think we can conclude that for sure because the first time indication he gives us is later. So I hope that does your question justice. Let me just check the comments and see if I've missed something. Oh yeah, we do have early in the morning in Mark 15:1. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so maybe then, all right, good, I missed that. So we've got, hand him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, so this seems to be the same. No further reply. Okay, so I would say it's possible between 5 and 6, just how it reads. And I'm doing this in English. We'd want to go back to our translation. It's possible that there's a shift in time that Mark doesn't note. although he's already with Pilate, and this is just background, so we're in the same scene. Yeah, so anyway, I think I'd want to look at this more, but yeah, based on, we have this early in the morning in 15:1, and then we have another still early in the morning later, and no explicit indication of time. Yeah, it would look like this is all the same day still. Let me know if there's a follow-up. I really appreciate that question. I think that's fun to look at, and I'll look at that on my own later. You may wish to do the same. Somebody says it takes 20 minutes to go from high priest's house to Pilate's location, wherever it was located. Somebody else says the time requires civil court to be open. I've got some good comments here. I'll just put them in the chat and read them. And we also know Pilate to Herod the Pilate, then soldiers mark in this episode, so sometime between 8 and 9. Yeah, I'm not, and it sounds like the others are saying the same here. I'm not seeing an explicit shift apart from the two kind of known times in 15:1 and then 15. Where is it? 15:25. So I think my first initial read would be what I think I'm hearing others say, which is we're all still kind of in the same early morning place. But again, Mark doesn't say. And interestingly, there is, and I'll use this to shift to the next verse. There is a kind of I would call it a terrible timelessness to this passage. So historically, we can locate it at a specific time, maybe. I mean, I think this is the kind of work we want to do and do it together. And I haven't checked the commentaries on timing. They may say the same thing. I think in terms of the scene itself and how Jesus would have experienced it, and even with these imperfect verbs, these iterative verbs that Mark is about to use in the next verse, I think it all could be within a short period of time, but it sure doesn't feel like it. And Mark is painting a picture of a long and torturous and unending agony kind of scene. So I think two things could be true. I think historically it could all be the same few hours. Experientially for Jesus, certainly this feels interminable, and I think Mark wants the readers to get that sense too. Here's what I mean with that in verse 17, and again, that's an interpretation. I could be wrong about that, but let's move to verse 17. I'll show you what I mean. Mark goes on, kai en didouskousin auton porphyron kai periti theasin auto plaisantes akantheon Stephanon. And we've got, and they dressed him in purple, my translation, twisting together a thorn of crowns, they put it on him. And they clothed him in purple and twisting, and putting on him, let's see, we've got here's the main verb, and they put on him a crown of thorns. There's a participle here. Let me just open up the diagram so we can look at this visually. And I have not really done much with it in translation, but it could be worth doing. We've got this, actually these are in the present. So there's an interesting timelessness here, even before we get to the iterative imperfect verbs of 19. Here we've got this present active indicative. They're clothing him. It's arguably this historical present where Mark is doing it for the sake of vividness, and you're right there in the moment. It's vivid, it's extreme, it's intense. They're clothing him in purple, and they are putting on him a crown of thorns that they have twisted together. So here's the participle, plaisantes. So a left to right reading would be, and they dressed him in purple, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And you could just translate this all as indicative verbs. And they dressed him in purple and twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on him. Or I think one translation says, after they had twisted together a crown of thorns, that's taking the participle as temporal, they put it on him. Whether you want to bring out the historical present or not is up to you. That would have certainly a striking effect on the reader to go back and forth from present and past. Of course, this is a past narrative, so I think the past tense in English is appropriate, but it is just worth noting that Mark makes this move here. I'll come back to those iterative imperfects in just a moment, but already in terms of time, we're getting a certain kind of timelessness, I think, in this passage, which I think would connect with folks' experience of abuse, that time can sort of be ruptured, it can stand still. I don't know that Mark is doing that on purpose with the verbs. I know that is one possible way to read it. Let's look more in detail at this verse. It says endiduskousin. That's from endidusko, which is to put on clothing, to dress, or to put on. And what are they putting on? Well, it just says they're putting on purple. And I've left it like that in translation. I'm not sure I would leave it that way in a final translation. You're going to see purple robe. The ASV just gives us clothe him with purple, so they're pretty straight up in the translation. But you've got robe, cloak. Those are the two options you'll see, or just clothe him in purple. The SIL Exegetical Summary series gives us a catalog of readings on this from different commentaries and translation footnotes. It says the purple cloak probably refers to an old military cloak whose red color suggested royalty. This ugly scarlet cloak was to serve as the royal purple mantle that was worn by kings on state occasions. So I think we could wonder about whether we just leave it as purple or bring it out more explicitly with cloak or coat. What Mark is doing is building up this mockery of Jesus as royalty. And this is just the beginning. They have led him away. They've started to gather people around. So if you're reading this very slowly, the tension is building, the magnitude of things is building. They dress him in purple. The fact that this is a crown of thorns shows us this is not real homage that they're doing. The purple then will go with the crown, and we'll get more this acclamation, this naming of king. And so the purple there, I think in this particular passage, has to do with royalty. Stephanon, from Stephanos, a crown or a wreath made more specifically of foliage or designed to resemble foliage and worn by one of high status or held in high regard. Again, this is well worth doing some more research on. This will be a word that you'll have in other Greek texts besides the Greek New Testament. This would be, yeah, there's going to be a lot of history about where this comes from. And so it could be the prize. In fact, let me just pull up this lexeme and we'll look ahead to Paul's letters here. Let me get an English translation open quickly. This word may be familiar because Paul talks about people as a crown, crown of righteousness, sort of a prize for competing in a sense, and that's all within the historical meaning here. But again, taken together with the word purple and the verse that follows, this crown is meant to evoke royalty, or not royalty in this case because they're mocking him. It is a crown of thorns, a kanthinon, not the material that a crown is usually made of. Foliage, wreath, you're not going to find thorns as a typical, maybe a gold crown, but this already in the materials is a mockery. I know that may go without saying, and especially if you're used to this passage, but it is to say that we've got words and symbols that would have existed outside of this crucifixion narrative. So if we come to the biblical text, perhaps without historical context, and we think about a crown, for example, we might right away go to a crown of thorns, but that's not typically what a crown is. So this is a subverting of these royal symbols or emblems. And verse 18 is even more explicit in this mockery theme. It clarifies even further. We'll go to verse 18. Kai ersanta aspases thaiautan, kaire basileu ton eudaion. And they began to, I would gloss this as greet initially, but it's really to praise or acclaim him. And they began to acclaim him, hail or rejoice or long live the King of the Jews. And I have here in translation, and they began to mockingly acclaim him, hail King of the Jews. This ersanta, just a little point of grammar, ersanta aspasesthai is they began to acclaim him. So this ersanta is aorist. It is a snapshot. It is a single point in time where they began to acclaim him, but as a complementary infinitive, this is it's serving as a transition from the dressing to the mock acclaiming, but the mockery is ongoing. The beginning is just in a point of time. There was a point of time after Jesus is dressed, present tense, in purple, where they began to mock him, and that's ongoing. And then from there, we get to the iterative imperfects in the next verse. I just think this really interesting transition that Mark does. Again, maybe I'm overreading it, but I think he really evokes the timelessness or the real rupture in time that this kind of experience would create for Jesus, even for the reader who could be vicariously traumatized by reading this, certainly thinking about disciples expecting a different kind of kingship maybe, or wanting him to take power and that kind of thing. This would not be the expected thing. And so we get the present tense here, aorist, beginning, then the ongoing, and then the imperfect. Again, I'm not sure that's even something to bring out in translation, but it did stand out to me as I studied this. We have a couple words here that I think have a unique translation here. Like I said, I would typically gloss aspasesthai as to greet. This is a word that you'll see, for example, at the end of Paul's letters. If I just skip ahead here, here's Romans 16, for example. He's saying, greet this person, greet that person, greet this person. That's the end of Romans. I know I'm going kind of quickly through this, but all these greetings. So when I see that word, I think it means greet, especially because I've been reading some of Paul's letters lately. I think in this sense, though, because we're in this kingly motif, there is more of an acclamation. And in fact, Mark within this verse clarifies by saying with what words they greeted him. It's hail, King of the Jews. So it's more than just a greeting. It's claim or praise. I think it's the Net Bible that has salute. They began to salute him. So I think we want something stronger than the maybe typical gloss of greet. And in fact, BDAG gives us of homage to a king, hail, acclaim. So I would do something along those lines here. Same with kaire. I see that and I think of rejoice, which is a good gloss for it. In this case, it locates it under, let's see here. We've got a formalized greeting, wishing one well, to use such a greeting, sarcastic greeting as king. This, I think, could be hail, or the NET notes that this could be understood as something like long live the king. Again, we've got here these stock, the color, the crown, the acclamation, even the language, even naming him specifically as a king. So I put that here in the note. Dressed like a king, crowned like a king, acclaimed like a king, even named explicitly a king, yet it's all done in mockery. So my question for you, and your question that you could consider, is, do you want to bring this out in your translation? I have split the difference here just to show you what it would look like. I'm not sure I would put the word mockingly in there explicitly. I think the passage makes it pretty clear when we get to the next verse that this is not sincere. Maybe it's already clear. But that is a question to consider. Do you want to bring out that disdain more explicitly, or do you think the text already does that work for itself? Well, what we wouldn't want is readers thinking that they're actually worshiping him. Although, again, I think by the time you get to the end of the passage, Mark is putting that thought to rest. I mean, they're clearly mistreating him in some pretty major ways. Let me just note this and then we'll pause for questions. R.T. France, in his New International Greek Testament commentary, talks about this word spasmai, is usually a quite general word, he says, for greeting, as I noted with Paul's letters. He said we've seen it used a more formal expression of respect. Kaire basileo parodies the customary greeting for the emperor, Ave Caesar. He says, in mocking the title which had formed the basis of Jesus's condemnation, remember we had King of the Jews earlier, that title in chapter 15, the soldiers reflect Pilate's view that he posed no real threat. As members of neighboring ethnic groups, they found the idea of a Jewish king hilarious. So they, according to France, and again, that's a point of interpretation, but I think it's a compelling one, they can treat him this way because they don't think he's anywhere even close to a real king. You would never treat a real king this way. One does wonder, though, and this is just something to take away from this text, why, if he's so much not a threat, spend all this time abusing him? I think that's a question worth pondering, and I don't know that this text itself, this passage, makes it clear. But what is clear is that whether you want to bring this out explicitly or not, even though we're getting language of royalty, we're getting the clothing of royalty, well, minus the thorns, I guess that's already clarifying. This verse taken by itself is very much not to be read on the surface of they're actually praising him, although they're using that language. Very sarcastic. This, I think, is just a limitation of any written text, translated or not. This would be exceedingly clear if you were to turn this into a screenplay and have folks act this out. They would act out the sarcasm. It would be dripping in their voice. You don't get that in the text, but again, I think it's pretty clear as the passage goes on here. Let's pause there and see questions or comments you've got. Yeah, here, this is a good comment. Yeah, so add this to my list of things I wonder about. Maybe you do too. Somebody says, surprising that an ultra expensive monarch's purple robe is used, while on the other hand, an inexpensive mockery thorny victor's crown is used. I think, yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, I don't remember where I read it, but there is, if we just, and I'll take just a brief moment to do this. If you go to Matthew, and the parallel here, let's see what they say about the robe. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Yeah, we've got a different word there. After twisting some thorns into a crown. I don't remember what commentary I read this in, but somewhere I read that they were just using what was on hand. And again, Mark doesn't say that explicitly, that's an interpretation, but I think that could explain why they're using, the coarse thorns and yet have like a nice robe because one's on hand. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a contrast there for sure. And I do wonder about that. All right, let's move on to verse 19. It gets worse. I mean, the title of this webinar, I think, makes pretty clear what this is about. So obviously this is a sensitive issue. So just want to note that for people that when we talk about abuse, it can be difficult. So I just honor that. And, if you need to step away, please feel free to do so. Verse 19. Now here is where it gets, it's hard to rate. It's all terrible, but this is where Mark brings in the imperfect. And there's this iterative action. Let me read the Greek first and then we'll unpack it. Kai etupton autou ten kephalein kalamo, kai eneptuon auto, kai tithentes ta gonata prosekunun auto. Let me just go left to right first, and then we'll smooth it out. And they were beating him the head, or they were beating his head, and they were beating his head with a reed or with a staff, and they were spitting upon him, and they were putting down the knees, and putting down the knees, they were worshiping him. So here's a slightly smoother version of that. And they repeatedly hit his head with the staff and spit on him, and bending their knees, they paid fake homage to him. Again, I don't think I'd leave that in a final translation, but I don't want to give the sense that they're actually paying homage to him. Probably the repeatedly hitting his head with the staff and spitting on him already makes that clear. So I think in the end, I think the text speaks pretty clearly for itself. Three main actions in this verse. Let me open the diagrams tool so we can see them together. Right here, we've got a tupton, a neptuon, and prosekunon. So the first one is to beat or to strike or to hit. The next one is to spit. And the last one is to worship or to do obeisance or to do homage, to pay homage. By the way, it's interesting here, a tupton and a neptuon do have a really similar sound. Prosekunon does not, but I mean, it's very difficult to translate things like poetry or rhymes or alliteration or consonants from one language to another, but it just occurs to me that if you thought this a tupton and a neptuon, if you wanted to preserve something like that, you've got hit and spit. So again, you can't translate rhymes or assonants or consonants very well one language to another, but you could do that here, just as it turns out. So they hit him, they hit his head, and they spit on him. These are the three main verbs, and the note from the New English translation has these as an iterative imperfect. So we talked before about the different kinds of imperfect there can be, and in this case, we've got an iterative, like they're doing it over and over again. So they are hitting what? Well, here's the accusative, the head, autu, his. So they're hitting his head. Here's a dative, with a staff. That's one thing they're doing over and over. It's in the imperfect. And here's another imperfect. They are spitting on him, and they are paying homage to him by bending the knee. Over and over, all of these things. So consider that. If you also see this as an iterative imperfect, which I think seems pretty clear to me, that Mark has already shown us that he could have used the present tense as he did, and he could have used the aorist, and now he's using the imperfect. So to me, this is one of those cases where I think it's pretty clear this is iterative. So think about that. Do you want to say repeatedly or again and again? You're importing an English word that isn't explicitly in there, but that's just because our imperfect verbs, our past tense verbs, don't necessarily carry the same power as that kind of an imperfect could in Greek. It says tithentes taganata, bending the knees, or perhaps better, bowing down. That's a more literal posturing there, but it's all connected to this prosekunon of doing homage to him. France says that this word, just like with aspazomai, we had greeting, and this word proskuneo, often translated as worship. He says it sounds to us like religious worship. Again, if you just kind of on first glance think, what was that word that I learned in Greek? Oh yeah, it's worship. But he says both terms are commonly used for acts of homage to a social superior, and in this context are a natural part of the mocking recognition of Jesus's royal majesty. So while this word proskuneo is used of worshiping, for example, God, I don't think this is necessarily that they're fake worshiping him as a deity. Again, the context is kingship. So I don't think deity, I mean, I don't know what's in their heads, but Mark doesn't give us any indications that they're mocking his claims to deity. It's his purported claims to kingship. And we saw that earlier with Pilate. So I think, so in other words, a word by itself like this gives us the option of, is it worship, as you would do with a deity? Here's BDAG, to transcendent beings, or a deity in a monotheistic cult. This doesn't mean cult in the pejorative sense. It means a worship, like a religion. Or is it like homage that you would do to a social superior? I think the context here compels us to translate it as, this is homage to a social superior. I mean, it's fake, you know, they're all kind of enacting this through mockery. But that's why I go with homage and not worship here. Fake or not, mocking or not, I don't think they're mocking the act of divine worship. They're mocking the act of homage to a king. And again, feel free to disagree with that, but I think the context suggests that. And France notes this here too, that this is not about religious worship being mocked. It's about doing homage to a king being mocked. And the soldiers are doing, again, something you never do to a king. So yes, the purple, yes, the thorns, I mean, yes, the crown, not the thorns. Yes, the kneeling of the knees, yes, the obeisance or the homage, but definitely not the beating him or the spitting on him. You would never do that. France is noticing here that they're adding to the brutality of Jesus's earlier flogging. So this is not the first time Jesus is physically beaten. We saw this just in the transition verse to this passage today. It talks about how the spitting underlines the contempt which their mockery expresses. So this maybe answers the question that I posed earlier. If he is not a threat to them as a king, so that they can mock him, why do they bother? Well, I think they're animated. I mean, I think France is right. Mark doesn't say this explicitly, but they've got to be animated by some kind of disdain, hatred. I mean, it's the anthropological question of, why do humans mistreat one another? Why this abuse? And I think this contempt is on the right track. This is just a personal, I don't mean to get on a soapbox here, but I've seen a lot of Bible passages that call this Jesus is mocked, and that's quite true. He is mocked here. This will transition us to our next verse. But so NRSV, the soldiers mock Jesus. The NET Bible, Jesus is mocked. What do we get in the NIV? The soldiers mock Jesus. Let's see what the ESV has. Jesus is mocked. Yeah, so there may be another heading, but I think this is, and again, headings were not in the manuscripts. We know this. This is just kind of part of the interpretation, and so there's always freedom to disagree. I'm not clear why we get that as a heading so often, because he is mocked for sure, and he's physically abused. I think that is, of course, the crucifixion itself is going to be torture. I think already he's being tortured, and I think that's important to bring out. Now, we're not talking about Bible headings, we're talking about translation, but presumably our translations will have Bible headings. They don't have to, of course, but I would think they would, just to kind of help orient ourselves to the text. So I would just suggest that if you are coming up with a heading for this, I would want very much to note both the, and that's how I've named it here, both the verbal, emotional, psychological mockery, abuse, however you want to label that. That's what we get with all of these headings, and the physical abuse. I mean, that's also pretty strong in this passage. So to me, that would be important to include in a section heading. We'll move to one more verse to wrap up. Let me just check with you and see, these have been great comments and questions so far. Let me add a few more from you. Somebody says a robe or a cloak could have been old or abandoned and hence not a nice garment. Great. Yeah, that's back to that question of why would we have a nice robe and not nice thorns? And that matches with what I read in wherever it was. I'm sorry, I don't remember where, but it said something similar, that they were just taking things that were on hand to mock Jesus. Here's a good comment to somebody says, tupton requires a reed of substantial nature, not flimsy reed, such as staff, stick, etc. Yeah, and again, that I think to really understand this passage, we want to, I know we go a little quickly over some of these words, but this would be, here's the word kalamo, stalk or staff. This would be worth further research, just to make sure that you're not under translating what's really happening here. Thanks for that comment. Here's a question, and why do the Romans take back the robe? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe folks can think about that, and that's a great transition to our next verse, verse 20. Kai hati, because they do leave the crown of thorns on him, right? I mean, at least in Christian tradition, we've got to have a notation of that as we come up. Yeah, all right, so good question. Hold it before us as we move forward. Why do they take back the robe? Let's do our last verse today. I'm mindful of the time. I know we're coming up on the hour. Kai hati en nepaisan auto, ezedusan autan, tain porphuran, kai enedusan autan, ta hematia autu. Kai ezagusin autan, hinastauros sosin autan. Left to right, and when they mocked him, really after they had mocked him, they took off the purple. They took the purple off of him, the purple clothing, the purple cloak, robe, and they put on him his clothes. They put his own clothes back on him. And or then they led him out. So we've got X plus ago, or ek plus ago. They led him out in order to crucify him. Interesting that we see this as a new paragraph in the middle of a verse. This, I think, could go with verse 21, or it could stay with verse 20. We'll probably use it to pick up next time. But just a few notes here. I'll have to give a very brief comment on this, but I put a longer note in your handout from the SIL Exegetical Summary Series. This hati and nepaisan auto, when they had mocked him, when they had finished mocking him, you might see in a translation. Now, again, back to the tenses, and the more I look at this, actually, the more convinced I am that Mark is doing this on purpose. Now we have the aorist again, which typically, yes, past tense, but the past tense as viewed a certain way, typically as viewed as like a snapshot or a point in time. And so what Mark is doing now, again, maybe I'm overreading it, but I think Mark now with the aorist is taking what we had in the vivid historical present, the punctiliar aorist beginning to, and then the imperfect iterative, they were doing this over and over. Now Mark is stepping back and seeing everything he just described, this interminable, timeless torture and abuse, which certainly would be how Jesus would have experienced it. Anybody would. Now he's taking a step back, I think, with the aorist and saying when all this was done. So, and I think that hati there, together with the aorist verb, when they had mocked him, when they were all done with that, what Mark is doing, I think now, is taking what was a long and almost time outside of time of Jesus's abuse and just summing it up when all that was done, and then moving us on to the next scene. That's not to minimize it, but I think it is to almost summarize it, and I think that's what the aorist is doing there. But the hati, I think, is what makes me want to think about that. And so you can see some different translations here: when they had finished, when they were done, after they finished. Interesting, the New Living Translation gives us when they finally tired of mocking him. That's more interpretive. It doesn't say anything about them being tired, but there is this sense of they're done now with this and they're doing the next thing. I'll just note this in closing, and we'll have time to stay on for questions if you've got time. This taking off of the cloak and putting his own clothes back on him, and there's this question of what do they do with this? I just noted this is yet another way in which they are overriding Jesus's own autonomy. And here again, it's his physical autonomy. They're just doing whatever they want to with him. And what they want to do is inflict pain on him. And here they're done mocking him. And maybe this is why we get that passage heading, because this summary aorist here is mocking. But I think you could say after they had finished mocking and physically abusing him, to sum it up, now they're reclothing him, which you could read as like, okay, they're kind of resetting it to normal. But I just note that they're still overriding his agency. They're still dressing and undressing and dressing him at will. There is the shame of nakedness. I think you could make the point that there's sexual abuse here too, because they're stripping him of his clothing. And I note that to say that I think Mark is transitioning us away. I don't think that this particular idea of unclothing and reclothing him, I don't think that's like, and then they kissed and made up and they gave him his clothes back and they were done being mean to him. I think this itself, even though they're done with the explicit mocking, I think this itself still includes humiliation and is a form of abuse. Again, that's a point of interpretation. You can disagree, but I don't want to just read this as they're resetting it as if they're like actually a fan of him now or anything like that. In fact, they lead him away to further torture. So this is not an innocuous phrase here. Whether that comes out in translation or not, I don't think it necessarily does, but it is something worth noting. And this is, I think, a really important and, of course, sensitive point of interpretation and application in this passage, which is that Jesus has known multiple kinds of abuse existing together. We've got just about every kind of abuse here in this passage. And it moves us to the crucifixion scene itself. So even before, and that's why I said at the very beginning, I'll wrap up with this, even before we get to the climactic crucifixion scene, of course, the resurrection is the ultimate climax of the book, but even before we get to the crucifixion, there's already intense abuse happening. So I don't want to just read this as a transition scene, even though in some ways it, physically it kind of functions that way because they're moving him from point A to point B. In terms of the narrative, this is moving it along to all the lead up to the crucifixion, but already even before Jesus gets to the cross, he's just been treated horribly. So I'll wrap up maybe with that. Obviously not a cheery note. This is a difficult passage and just a terrible way to treat any human, let alone someone that maybe is fully human, fully divine, maybe the God of the universe, you could say theologically. So that we'll go into the crucifixion next time. I'll pick up again with this phrase here that maybe fits in verse 20, maybe fits in verse 21. But let's do this. I'm going to end the recording since we're over time, and then I'll stay on for any other questions that folks have. So if you've been watching this recording, I want to thank you for being here and just say again, tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes has this and all the other handouts. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com.